I don't need to tell anyone in this room much about Judy Rebick. You've all heard from her, you know her, you've seen her in the media, you know what an incredible spokesperson she has been for the progressive left, for the popular progressive movements in this country. You know how she has displayed incredible courage and taken very principled positions throughout her career on the progressive front in Canada. I think most people remember her in terms of her years as president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, where she took incredibly tough positions in the face of great adversity. I think most people probably remember the Constitution above all else, and the kind of as Jim said to me earlier, the number of suits she had to debate on TV and other places on this and other issues. She's worked in many other areas, as you can see of the pamphlet. She's been a strong spokesperson on issues of concern to people with disabilities. She's been very active in the reproductive choice movement, and she is now, and she continues to be vocal on in the media, on commentary programs, on newscasts, and most notably and most recently, she is the co-host of Face Off, which is a CBC News World debate show, which happens every night of the week, and she is there in full format and debating form, taking on what's his name? Claire Hoy. And we just appreciate the work you're doing, Judy, and we're very grateful that you came to be with us this evening. Thank you.
Well, maybe God was in the yes camp, because I'm debating more suits now than I ever did before. Well, I'm actually very honored to be here. I don't get around much anymore because I do this show every night of the week. Well, now I don't do it on Friday anymore. The last time I was in Winnipeg was 2 years ago at the Folk Festival. And I used to get to Winnipeg quite a bit because I traveled so much, but now I'm sort of stuck in Ontario, which is getting worse and worse, and I'll come back to that. But the reason I'm honored is not just because I like Winnipeg, which I do, and it's nice to see people again, but because I'm honored to be invited by Choices, because I think Choices has played a very important leadership role in this country in pointing the way forward for progressive forces. And I'm going to talk about why I think that later in my talk. But I think that Choices had a lot of the right ideas before anybody else. They provided the leadership and the vision, and now are really actually organizing it at a national level around the alternate budget, which I think is incredibly important. And so I want to say that I'm honored to be here because I think that Choices, as we always know that Winnipeg has been the crucible of political radicalism in Canada for generations. It's although you do produce a few bad ones like Andrew Coyne too, but that I think that Choices has played and continues to play an incredibly important role, and I'll talk later about why that is. Well, if I'd come when I was invited, which was about a month and a half ago, I would have been really depressed. When they asked me to give an inspirational speech in July, I thought, oh my God, because I'm kind of like the Mary Poppins of the left. I always see a silver lining. I'm always optimistic. I don't know how. I've been active for 25 years. But in the last number of months, I've been kind of getting pretty depressed, particularly in Ontario. And you'll forgive me if I talk a fair bit about Ontario in this speech, because I think it's important that everybody understand what's happening there and how frightening it is. The day before yesterday, I went to a demonstration at Queen's Park. Now, it's not often we storm the barricade. I wasn't storming the barricades. I wasn't there at the time. I'm a journalist now. I'm not allowed to do things like that. But anyway, and the reason for my optimism was a couple of things. The first thing was that it was the biggest demonstration at Queen's Park in Ontario since 1984 when they tried to shut down the Morgentaler Clinic. And the demonstrations around the Morgentaler Clinic were built by a coalition of groups that have been working together for 3 years. This was built by a coalition, yes, but the core organizing group is 5 women under 25 who decided to organize a demonstration the day of the swearing in. And a lot of the formal leadership of the labor movement, for example, said, oh no, we can't do that, it'll look bad to do that. You know, it's too soon. And these young women organized a demonstration at the swearing in, before they did anything or announced anything, of 2,000 people. And everybody said, you shouldn't have done that, it was too small, it makes us look weak. But what they did is they created a balance of forces. People saw people come out. And so when they went to the Labor Council and said to the Labor Council, let's organize a demonstration at the throne speech, the Labor Council came in and there was a real grassroots organizing effort that went on. Now, it wasn't very long from the swearing into the throne speech, 3-4 weeks. But people really mobilized. And the coalitions that often we've built at a top-down level, like the Coalition for Social Justice, for example, which often exists as labor activists or leftists in the labor movement meeting together, but it hasn't really gotten to the grassroots, formed the networks that now allow us to organize at a grassroots level. And I can tell you that at that demonstration, and I'll come to the storming the barricades in a minute, at that demonstration, I've been an activist in Ontario for 15 years, and out of 8,000 people, I maybe knew 100 people. It was young people, it was poor people, it was workers, not just trade union activists, but workers. It was public sector workers who I've never seen on a demonstration before, like coming out of Queens, out of the area there. And it was a noon-hour weekday demonstration of 7,000 or 8,000 people. And people are angry. And that's why you had that confrontation at the front of Queen's Park. But I think it's important to talk about that confrontation, because the demonstrators were not violent. The police were violent. All the demonstrators did, and those of you who are veterans like me of demonstrations know that we do this whenever there are barricades, is you go up to the barricades and you push a little, and you see how far they're going to let you push, right? Well, in this case, there were about 200 cops who were already in riot gear with batons. And the cops said, stand back. But they didn't give the demonstrators time to stand back. Within a minute of saying stand back, they started clubbing people. Now, then somebody tries to spin it that the demonstrators were violent. The demonstrators weren't violent, the cops were violent. But the image that we had on the national news, and I think it was important we had that image, even though I didn't particularly agree with what that group of people did, because the organizers had decided not to do that, is the province of Ontario in a throne speech, which when Bob Rae came to office was a tremendous celebration with Bob Rae playing the piano and everyone singing. When David Peterson came to office, there was hot dogs on the lawns of Queen's Park, and when Mike Harris came to office, there were cops in helmets with truncheons beating on demonstrators. And that image tells us more about what we're facing in Ontario and what the policies of Mike Harris mean than anything else. Now, I can tell you that I've learned a lot about the right. You know how they say how Inuit people have like 30 different words for snow? Well, I used to think the right's the right, okay? To me, everybody from, David Peterson, maybe he was in the center, but everybody from, Dalton Camp to David Frum, they're just right-wingers, right? But I have learned the subtleties now. And I can tell you that Mike Harris is far to the right of Ralph Klein. Far to the right. He has a much more extensive agenda. Ralph Klein is basically an opportunist. He smelled the right-wing air, and he moved that way. Mike Harris is a true conservative. He's always been a conservative. He was on the outs in his party when his party was more a red Tory party. And he is an ideologue, and he has people advising him like Tom Long and now David Frum, who make Newt Gingrich look progressive. And his agenda, he's just getting going. It's bad enough, the so-called common sense revolution is bad enough. But he's planning much worse, and we already know that. So he said initially he was going to cut $6 billion. Now it's $9 billion. $9 billion. He's said initially he's going to scrap Bill 40, which was the NDP labor law. Now there's rumors that he's going to go after the Rand formula, that he's going to look at right-to-work legislation possibly in the future. He said he wasn't going to touch health care. Well, now he's cutting health care. You might have heard that there's hospitals closing down in Toronto. They're going to cut health care, but they're also talking about privatizing aspects of health care. And it's moving very fast, very fast. Now, what I want to talk about is I think that in the last 4 years, well, since 1992, I guess, which is 3 years, only 3 years, there has been such a rapid move to the right in this country that it's dizzying. It's dizzying. And I want to talk a bit about why I think it's happened. There's, of course, the objective reasons, which is globalization. We've had a massive restructuring of capitalism on a global level, and the result all over the world is similar. And that's something else I learned in Wairau in China. In the South, it's meant structural adjustment programs, and in the North, it's meant cuts in social programs. It's also meant a weakening of the power of national governments to provide social services, education, and health care to their people, and a strengthening of the coercive aspects of national governments in the states. So what we see in Canada, which is the right wing who says, no, the government should be out of everything except prisons, right? The only thing they don't cut back on is prisons. They even cut on the justice system. They don't really care if it's fair trials that much, as long as they go to jail. And the one area that they're prepared to spend money on is prisons. In the United States, it's phenomenal. I mean, the United States has the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world. Now, we're not talking about just the North. We're talking about the entire world. And in the South, what it means is that governments have less and less ability to spend money on the provision of social services because of the policies of the World Bank and the IMF, which are insisting that they pay back the debt, and yet they maintain huge arsenals because of the pressure on the global economy from the armaments industry. And this is something that I wasn't as aware of. So part of the reason for all the civil wars and the wars that we're seeing all over the world is precisely this push of the armaments industry to make money from the South and from third world governments. The second thing we're seeing is that the fall of, and here I'll talk about the North, about Canada, North America, Europe, is that the fall of income. Now, we all know that our income hasn't been rising, but there's some good statistics. Statistics Canada, and this is something I recommend to you, has put out some very good reports lately that give us a lot of ammunition to fight back against the right. In 1993, the average family income was down 1.7% from 1980. So in 13 years, not only hasn't our income gone up, it's gone down. But if there hadn't been social programs, if there hadn't been social assistance and UI, the average income would have gone down 7.2%. Okay? And so poor people's income has gone down even more. I don't have the 10-year fact, but I can tell you that a single parent, and that's mostly single mothers, as we know, from 1992 to 93, the income of single parents, and this is before the cuts to social programs, before the really serious cuts to social programs, went down 7%. 7%. So what's happening, and the reason why there's a base for the right, is because people are feeling, the average person is feeling that they're working harder and they're making less money and they're paying more taxes, and that's true. Not because there's too many people on welfare or unemployment insurance, but because the restructuring that's happened has meant that the tax burden falls disproportionately on middle class and middle income people, and that we're making less money. So what people are feeling, what the right is speaking to, is real. The other thing I learned in Wairau is that I talked about the different shades of right. Well, the global forces that are causing all this to happen, we can call them the forces of globalization. And we have the elites in Canada, the Liberals and the Tories, who have supported this process through supporting free trade, restructuring, and so on and so forth. In a sense, the right is a response to that. The radical right, the Klein and Harris right, is a response to that globalization. Because people feel that things are out of their control. They feel like they're making less and working harder. And they're doing, of course, we know that the reason all this is happening is because of restructuring of capitalism, because of globalization. But that's a very abstract thing. You can't see that, you can't touch it, and we all feel like we can't fight it. It's much easier to think that the reason it's happening is because of these no-good deadbeat welfare recipients who are eating up all our money, all our tax money. Or it's happening because of these rotten politicians who are spending like crazy and not taking our money seriously. And so when you have a Klein or Harris who says, this is what we have to do, we have to cut our spending. In Harris's case, we have to cut taxes because that's going to create jobs. We have to get rid of those special interest groups that have been running the country and listen to the citizen. Empower. This word empower. You know, sometimes I'm sorry about words we create. This is one I'm getting very sorry about. It is in everything the Reform Party writes and everything that Harris writes. Empower the individual citizen, they say. But what they're saying that's meaningful to people is two things. First of all, they have vision and they're providing leadership. They're saying this is what needs to happen, and they get into office and they do it. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. If you get elected on a mandate, I don't agree with the mandate they got elected on. But if you get elected on a mandate, you should carry it out and you should be prepared to struggle to carry it out. That's leadership. If Bob Rae had done that in Ontario, Mike Harris would not be Premier of Ontario today. And two, they do support a democratic change. You see, the Reform Party does support democracy. They actually really do, on a certain level, okay? Formal democracy. So, for example, why is it that it's Preston Manning saying if it's 50% plus one in Quebec, it should be a yes vote? Because he's a populist. He really believes in that. He really believes in that. And it's because of us, because of the women's movement, the environmental movement, the labor movement, that people want more control over their politicians. It's because we've taught them that you don't have to just elect people for 5 years, send them, and then forget about them and let them do whatever they want. We've taught them that you can actually have an influence over what politicians do once they get elected, that you can actually organize and fight for what you believe in. We've taught them that. But somehow the party that represented us in Parliament, or most of us, the NDP, didn't translate that into parliamentary democratic reform. The right did that. And that's the populism of the right. And I still believe this, and now maybe this is my naive optimism, that it's that populism, more than the right-wing economic policy, that got Harris elected, that got Klein elected, that got the Reform Party as many seats as they got, and it's what makes them popular, more than their economic policies. I believe that. Although I'm not denying this antagonisms to the poor, which I find quite horrifying, and I'll get to that. And so the right is providing for people an answer to the discomfort they feel about the effects of globalization. And I think we haven't understood that enough. I think we sort of lump them all together as the neoconservative agenda. But there's a difference between what the right is saying to people, the radical right, and what, the Mulroneys were saying, or the Bill Davises, or whoever, okay, or the Chrétiens, for that matter. Now, what is it that the right says to people? And I want to talk to you about this because, maybe I have, and I'm happy to accept that I have a deformed point of view because I'm with these people every day now, But I do know what they say, and this is what they say. First of all, they say, we can't afford social programs because of the deficit. Well, we've heard that over and over and over again, and the right and the left has caved. The left politically has caved into that. The NDP, the Liberals. There is no alternative to cutting social programs. The facts are, as you'll discuss tomorrow, no doubt, that the deficit has very little to do with social spending. It has everything to do with a revenue crisis because of tax reform and because of unemployment, and with high interest rates. And I recommend to you, if you haven't read Linda McQuaig's book, Shooting the Hippo, you should read it. It's not that the deficit isn't important. The deficit is important because the deficit represents a transfer of wealth from the poor and working people to the rich. As much as everybody will tell you, oh yeah, there's a little, this is what I get all the time, little old ladies, and they say this, little old ladies, or shareholders in the bank. Not too many, okay? Second, so we can't afford, so it starts out with we can't afford social programs. That's how it started, remember? Well, it started, free trade, we'll go back then. It was, oh yeah, free trade, we argued there'll be a downward pressure on social programs, we'll lose our social programs, and they said, oh no, free trade's going to help us, give us the money to finance. It's important to remember, the media has a very short memory. So it's important to remember. And what they said was, free trade will give us the money to fund social programs. As Brian said, social programs are a sacred trust, right? Okay. But now we can't afford social programs. Of course, we'd like to have them. That's the more moderate right. We'd like to have them, but we can't afford them. I'll get to the more radical right in a minute. The other, which is also not true, as was mentioned before, Canada spends about average in G7 on social programs now. That's pre-cuts, pre this bill C-76. Never had that good social programs compared to Europe. Really not that good at all. Around middling social programs. The Canadian government even today spends less of its GDP on social spending federally than the American government does, even though they have much worse programs. Okay. And then the next one, this is the one that blows my mind, is that the left has been running this country for 15 years and they've made a mess of it. And people believe this. Like, I get letters saying people like Judy have made a mess of this country. People like Judy have been running this country for too long. God, I can't even get elected in the NDP, let alone federally. The next one is, everything that in the public sector is bad and everything in the private sector is good. And this is the most amazing one, because when I was a young person, it was the other way around. Like, anybody who worked in the private sector was, a sellout, right? I don't remember. I forget the words we used for that in those days. But anyway, if you didn't work In the public sector, you were some kind of bourgeois, you know? But now it's the opposite. And if you in any way get paid by tax dollars, unless you're a doctor, of course, then you are a parasite. A parasite. Plain and simple. I got a letter the other day saying, Judy Rebick's never had a real job. You know, I worked for the Canadian Hearing Society for 15 years. That wasn't a real job because it got some public funding. I mean, anything you work for that gets any public funding, it's not a real job. And the public sector is inefficient. Government is inefficient and the private sector is efficient. So how come half the commercial space in downtown Toronto is sitting empty today if the private sector is so bloody efficient? How come in one generation we've almost dramatically reduced poverty among the elderly in Canada through our pension plan? The percentage of elderly Canadians living in poverty has declined from 20% in 1980 to 8% in 1990 if the public sector is so inefficient. How did we achieve that if the public sector is so inefficient? Right, that's right. That's right. Okay, so that's the other argument. The next one is that the market will solve everything. The solution to our economic problems is to free the market, free the companies. Now, we used to talk about the free trade deal as a Bill of Rights for corporations, a Charter of Rights for corporations, but that doesn't go far enough for them. They want to get rid of everything. They want to get rid of labor law, minimum wage, what they call payroll taxes, by which they mean UI payments and pension payments. They want to get rid of all of the, in their words, shackles on the market. But as I explained to you before, and we know this, if the market was unshackled, the division between rich and poor in this country would be, as it is in the United States, worse. And we can prove that. So that's an important argument to take on. And of course, the other thing about the market is that, you know, business cares about making profits. And now, because of the pressure of international investment, it cares about making profits obsessively, one could say, almost irrationally. So that, you know, the Bank of Montreal can make record profits and lay off 20,000 people. Like, it's crazy, right? They've gone, it's almost like there's a mass psychosis of corporations. Just make more and more profit for your investors. The hell with your workers, the hell with the public, the hell with the consumer. As long as we have to make over 10% profit, and next year we have to make over 12% profit. And the market doesn't redistribute income at all. The market doesn't help poor people. The market doesn't provide health care. The market doesn't provide education. Well, now we come to this part, which is 1 year ago in Toronto, in Canada, to argue that Medicare should be privatized was an impossible thing to say. It was so fringe that almost no responsible person would say it. To say that education should be privatized, even though they were doing it on the fringes, was impossible to say. But today it's being said openly. It's being said openly. And I'll just end on this on the right, is that, before I end on this, the other thing we're said is that it's social programs that create poverty and unemployment. Now, this is one that, I don't know, maybe somebody, I've heard this like at least 600 times in my show, and I still don't get it. Like, they think that unemployment insurance creates unemployment. You see, because it's so great to be on unemployment insurance that you just don't want to go to work again, right? I mean, everybody who's been on UI knows that. And welfare even more. So it creates dependency and it creates unemployment. And the reason we have unemployment is not because of free trade. It's not because of globalization. It's not because of these these heartless corporations that only want to make mega profits and pay their CEOs billions of dollars a year and let their workers go and feel no social responsibility whatsoever anymore, it's because it's so cushy on unemployment. Okay? And they've actually convinced people of that. And when you think about the mentality behind that, when you think about the mentality of a community in social services, I mean, I know you're a community and social services minister, said let them eat cake in the Beaujolais restaurant, and, you know, dined with the other ministers at, was it $3,000? 36. Our minister said when he was asked, well, what happens? As you know, the first action of the Harris government was to cut welfare 21.6%. And we're talking now, a single mother with a kid's going to have to live on $960 in the city of Toronto, where you cannot get an apartment for less than $750, okay? So that woman's going to have $200 a month to feed herself and her kids, and her kid, okay? And when he was asked by reporters what the government was going to do when these mothers couldn't feed their kids, he said, well, I guess we'll have to take the kids into care. So I guess next we're going to have poor houses in the province of Ontario. But it seems to me the next step. And orphanages, as Newt Gingrich said. But okay, he took it back. He said he was misquoted, which he wasn't, but the next day, Mike Harris, I always want to call Mike Harris Frank Harris. Frank Harris was a Victorian pornographer, and somehow I can't get this name out of my head. Mike Harris, in distancing himself from this comment about putting poor kids in care, said, and that he's our premier, he said, well, it's not the responsibility of welfare to make sure children are fed. We live in a country that the World Bank, not even the UN, the World Bank, not a radical organization, said is the second wealthiest country in the world. And in the wealthiest province in that country, we have a premier who is prepared to let children starve to give a 30% tax cut to his friends. It's disgusting. David Frum, I debated him on Morningside, and he said, as they all say, well, you know, he got elected, he has a mandate, and that's true. He got elected, he has a mandate, and we have to say that when people voted for him, they voted for his welfare reform. They did. But they didn't understand. I don't think they understood what it would mean. I didn't think they understood the heartlessness with which he would carry it out. And I don't think they understood the consequences in a city like Toronto, let alone the other cities, of making that kind of radical cut to people's income. We already have a lot of social division in the city of Toronto. The reason that it works as well as it does is because we had people who fought at the municipal level to maintain humane cities. We had people who created mixed social housing so that we didn't have ghettos. We have people who organized coalitions so we didn't have really vicious racial divisions. All of that now is under attack. All of that is under attack. And I believe if we don't mobilize, that Toronto in 5 years will be like Detroit or New York or Washington, well, maybe not as bad as Washington, D.C. Nothing could be that bad. And that's a really, I never thought I'd see that in Canada. I never thought I'd see that. So let's talk about what we're going to do. I talked about 3 reasons why this has happened. The globalization, the impact on the middle class's living standards, the appeal of the right, and now I want to talk about another reason, and that is the failure of leadership of the left. And I think the reason I want to talk about that is I think that looking self-critically at what we've done wrong, and when I talk about the left, I'm not talking about just the NDP, because it's easy to throw stones at the NDP. I'm good at it, just like everybody else. But the broad left, the NDP, the labor movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, all the progressive movements. I'm talking about when I use the word left. I'm not talking about the Liberals of Mulroney, however, but I'm talking about the broad progressive movement. The first thing I mentioned earlier, and that's at the electoral level, I don't think this is true at the level of social movements. There has been a failure of leadership at the electoral level, and we see it most at the provincial level, because we haven't had power at the federal level, but we saw it at the federal level too, and we'll come back to that. Where a government gets elected, like the Ray government, it had a mandate, it got elected on a platform, and as soon as business mobilized against it, it backed off. And so what happened was it created a cynicism in the voters. And the cynicism is they're all the same. Because the voters voted for whatever the media, the pundits tell you. They didn't vote for Bob Rae just because they were angry with Peterson, David Peterson. Because they could have gone right at that point. They didn't. They went left. And they went left because they thought the NDP was different and that the Liberals and Tories were the same. And they wanted something different. Bob Rae, when he was first elected and brought out that first budget, which was a left-wing budget, looked sort of like the last alternate federal budget a little bit. It wasn't that good, but it was good. Was 60% in the polls, just where Harris is today. But Bay Street mobilized, and they were under a savage attack from business. There's no question that they were. But instead of mobilizing their support, which they could have done, for example, by having a referendum on auto insurance, instead of caving in and dropping it. If they had had a referendum on auto insurance, they would have had an 80% vote, 85% vote in favor of public auto insurance. And they could have used that to get the corporations to back away. But they didn't, because they don't believe in direct democracy, and this is a fundamental weakness of the left. That the NDP and the trade union movement up till now does not believe in direct democracy, and therefore, if you're in a parliamentary position, you cannot mobilize your support. You cannot mobilize your support without direct democracy, because in our society, the NDP is not like some places in Latin America where a social democratic leader can go out and organize rallies and so on and so forth. Our political culture doesn't support that. So if you want to mobilize your base in a parliamentary democracy, referendums are the best way to do that. But in any case, even short of that, they didn't call on us for support. They didn't turn to their friends. In fact, they turned in many ways against their friends at a certain point. And we didn't, as our movements didn't, support them enough. Critical support. But we should have been out in the streets. When there was a demonstration of 1,500 Bay Street boys on the lawn of Queen's Park, we should have been on the lawn of Queen's Park the next day, and if not the next day, a month later. But because of the way in which we've always divided, well, particularly in the labor movement, we've always divided between the NDP as the political arm and we're, the economic arm and so on, although we've gotten over a lot of that, people didn't think to do that. Well, some people thought to do that, but not enough. And so there wasn't the counter-mobilization. We didn't understand that we're in a different period of politics. And this is the point I want to make here, is that when I ran for president of NAC in 1990, I'll never forget this. Somebody did a profile on me, the Toronto Star. And the woman said to me, Judy, it's sort of funny that you're taking this role because, you've been involved in the abortion struggle. Now, that's a very un-Canadian struggle. It's polarized. People feel passionately on both sides of that struggle. People in Canada aren't like that. And I said then, well, what about Meech Lake? That was pretty polarized. And I said then, politics in Canada is changing. It's becoming more polarized. What we have today in Canada is a very class-conscious, what we used to call in the 60s, ruling class. That is, the corporations today and their friends in the Reform Party, and I say the Reform Party even though most people don't think of it that way, the Liberals and the Tories, are very class-conscious. And what happened when the Bob Rae and I'm sorry to talk about Ontario, but I think it's instructive. When business mobilized against Bob Rae is we didn't understand that was class war, that we had to mobilize back or we were going to lose. And that was a failure of leadership, in my view. The second failure was that during the free trade fight, somehow we started defending the status quo. We fought against free trade, which was the right thing to do. I'm talking here about the free trade agreement. We were right. Everything we argued then, if you go back and look at it, came to pass. Everything. The Americanization of Canada, the loss of our social program, the rise in unemployment. Everything we said was correct. And we actually won popular majority, if you remember. If we didn't have such an undemocratic electoral system, things might have been different as well. That is, more people voted against free trade in that election than voted for it, if you remember. But in that fight, something happened, and that is the left became the defender of the status quo, understandably, because the liberals weren't doing it anymore. So we had to do it because we were defending the gains of working people, like unemployment insurance, like welfare, like Medicare, which have to be defended. We don't want to go backwards, we want to go forward. But the fact is, we want to go forward. We don't want to stay where it is. We're not satisfied with the status quo. We've never been satisfied with the status quo. And yet we started to sound like we were. And that's one of the reasons why the David Frums of the world can now say that the left has been running the country for 15 years and get some credibility in saying it. Because it sounds like we have a vested interest in the status quo. We were organized around issues. When Mulroney came in with his neoconservative agenda, we realized we couldn't fight issue by issue anymore. We had to take on this whole right-wing, what we thought then as right-wing, well, neoconservative, neoliberal agenda. And so we formed coalitions. The Pro-Canada Network, the Pro-Canada Network, now the Action Canada Network that we formed around free trade. But the problem with these coalitions, and it was important to form the coalitions, and most important in those coalitions was the alliance between the labor movement and the social movement, which continues to today, which we saw the power of in that demonstration at Queen's Park the other day. But the problem with the coalitions we built was they were top-down, and they didn't get to the grassroots. And this is where Choices was different, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm romanticizing Choices a bit, but I think Choices did get a more grassroots focus. But in other places, and certainly at the national level, the coalitions operated like leaders in back rooms negotiating deals, you know? And that can't work for us. It can't even work for them anymore, you know? It can't even work for the people in power anymore. They also have to have some level of populism. It certainly can't work for the people fighting for social change. And the power dynamics in those coalitions were too much like the power dynamics in society. So the unions who had the resources would often make the decisions. There was a lot of sexism. There was an absence of people of color or Aboriginal people in most of those coalitions. We didn't transform those coalitions in the way they needed to be transformed in a democratic way to really be able to mobilize people and to really speak to people about the issues at the base. Now, one of the things that the right wing and the NDP thinks, and somewhat in the labor movement as well, is that it was a mistake for the NDP and the labor movement to make this coalition with social movements, that the social movements are not loyal enough to the NDP. And that the focus on equality issues was divisive and weakened us. But I can tell, in my view, it's those things that have put us in a position today to fight back in a way that the movements are not in Britain in a position to fight back, are not in the same way in the United States. It's because we made gains on equality issues. Even today, Mike Harris, Ralph Klein, and Preston Manning will not say one word against women's equality, not even on the abortion issue. Okay? Mike Harris says, we support pay equity. Yeah, right. But he says that. Why? Because of the power of the equality movements, and particularly the women's movement. He can't get away with he can get away with attacking quote-unquote special interest groups, but he can't get away with attacking us on women's issues because of the strength of those movements and movements inside, outside the labor movement. So the strength of the social movements and the alliance between the social movements and the labor movement is what puts us in a position to fight back now if we learn from some of our mistakes. So we have to have alternatives. And this is where I think choices has blazed the way for us. The left for a long time said the deficit's not a problem. This is not true. The deficit is a problem. It's not social spending that's the problem. But, we can go back to the early days of Tommy Douglas, who never wanted to have, owe the banks money. Like, we don't want to owe the banks money. We don't want to owe international investors money either. We're not obsessed with it. Balanced budgets aren't necessary. But to have 30%, 40% of your budget going to pay interest is crazy. And it doesn't make any sense from a left-wing perspective at all. And so when Choices, and Choices was the first to do it, I think, in the country, did their first alternate provincial budget and actually produced a budget which not only protected but expanded social programs and reduced the deficit, I think that started to show us the way forward. And then the rest of the left slowly started to come around in the last 2 years and started to have debates about the deficit and what the problem was in the economy. And I think we're getting to a point now, we're just, where we really have some grasp economically of what an alternative would be at the international level, because you've got to deal with speculative capital. You've got to deal with the unbridled power of multinational corporations at the international level, with the unaccountability of World Bank and IMF and other international institutions that are having an enormous impact on all of our lives. We have to call for those to be democratized. These are some of the things we talked to in Moiroo. Things like the Tobin tax and other things at the international level. Getting the Bank of Canada, challenging this idea that government can't have any impact on the Bank of Canada. All progressive taxation. And this is another point I want to say about the weakness, is the tax issue. Now, if you remember, those of you that remember, who was it who first organized against the GST? Was it the Reform Party? Was it the Fair Tax Commission? No, it was us who organized against the GST. Okay? How did we give them the tax issue? How did that happen? It was the Ontario government that set up a Fair Tax Commission to restructure the tax system and then dropped it like a hot potato. And that was another mistake. Sorry, I forgot that one. Okay. So, developing the alternatives. But in developing the alternatives, we have to stop just defending the status quo, and this gets to tough stuff. The healthcare system is a good system in the sense that we all have public healthcare. We don't have to pay money. That's how it's good. The rest of it is not that good. Okay? Especially from a woman's point of view, but from anyone's point of view. High-tech, doctor-controlled medicine is not good for people. Closing hospitals in Toronto is not a bad thing. We have 42 hospitals in Toronto. They mostly provide fiefdoms for rich doctors and administrators. By the way, if you want to look at who's making a lot of money and who really is, I hate this word, but sucking at the teat of the public, look at hospital administrators making $250,000, $300,000 a year on public money, not welfare mothers who are making $1,000 a month. Restructuring healthcare is a good idea to make it more community-based. But let's make sure they're union jobs. Let's make sure that doctors don't control, that we have healthcare workers together in these community clinics. These are very good moves that feminist healthcare critics and other healthcare activists have been arguing for years. But because we're afraid about how the right's going to do it, instead of saying this is an alternative, we say no, don't close the hospitals. No, don't have community clinics. And we defend a system we don't agree with. Similarly, with welfare and UI. The UI system, first of all, Mulroney's cut it back unbelievably already. But, it's been a long time since I went on unemployment insurance. But the memory of going into the UI office is burned in my memory, okay? How degraded I felt in that experience, and it's 1,000 times worse getting welfare We don't agree with the way these things are organized. The workers in those systems don't agree with the way they're organized. And they know how to reorganize so that they're more community-based, they're more, et cetera. A guaranteed annual income, which has become a dirty word on the left. And, Jean Swanson, who'll be here tomorrow, disagrees with me on this. But why do we have what many poor people in Ontario call a poverty industry? You know what proportion of welfare payments go to pay agencies and bureaucrats? And don't go into the pockets of poor people so that those agencies and bureaucrats can police the poor people? And we're supporting that? Why shouldn't poor people just get a check at home? Why should somebody have to watch them and monitor them and so on? Why do we support that? So we have to look at the same time as we're looking at the economic alternatives, we have to look at how we want to deliver social services and it's hard, not let the attacks on the right stop us from providing creative alternatives and leadership. And I know it's hard because I do it on my show every night, and I often wind up defending the status quo because you're so horrified when someone says they want private Medicare so they can smoke. I mean, you start defending the current system, you know what I mean? Like, it starts to look pretty good, right? So it's uneasy to understand why we slipped into this, but we have to step away from it, step out of it, and think of a different strategy. The other thing is organizing. Now, we've gotten to a point, and again, choices is different here, but in Toronto, and at the national level, we got to the point where our idea of organizing is to call a press conference. Okay? And then our idea of success is whether we got on one channel or three channels or one paper or two paper, whether we made the front page or the back page, whether it's buried or it didn't appear at all. And there was a period where you could do things just through the media. I mean, NAC ran a campaign on refugee women. That was a media campaign. I mean, there had been women doing petitions, but basically that campaign to make violence against women a basis of refugee status was a media campaign. It worked. It was just good timing and made sense, and now the UN's adopted it. Like I tell you, then that was one that you could do. 3 years ago, we did it at a press conference, and everybody says, oh, Judy Rebick, she's gone too far this time. She wants to open the doors to abused women. This is crazy, blah, blah, blah. And 3 years later, it's now been adopted by the UN. So it is possible to seize an opening and run with it like that, but not very often, and certainly not in this period. And so when we got shut out of the media, which we have in the last year especially, when the media is turned against us, when the campaign against special interest groups, which the Reform Party and the Tories waged, actually started to have more of an impact on the media, and now even Paul Martin's talking about it, he's not going to let those special interest groups stop him from savaging Canada. We have to get back to our roots, to organizing at a grassroots level. In the 60s and 70s, we didn't have press conferences. They didn't come and if we had them, they wouldn't have come. The only way they'd ever come was when we showed we had some power at a grassroots level. And that's like that demonstration at Queen's Park. Why was the media coverage of that positive? And it was positive because the media went there and they didn't see people like me that they see everywhere. They saw young people, they saw poor people, they saw working class people, and they said, this is real. People are really angry about this. And that's what we have to do. People are really angry. People are hurting. And if we can provide them with another vision, then we can organize them. We can organize them to fight back. I don't believe that people in this country have become mean-spirited and vicious like Mike Harris and David Frum are. I really don't believe that. I've traveled coast to coast in this country, and I see people, not just people like you who are leftists, but when I was president of NAC, I met all kinds of people. And, there is an ethic in Canada. There's always been of sharing. There's been a collective ethic in Canada that's different than the United States. where people believe that just because you live in Newfoundland, you shouldn't be so much poorer than someone who lives in Ontario. That people believe that people who are doing better should share with people who are doing worse. And I want to leave you with two thoughts. The first one is a vector poll, which asks the question, would you be willing to pay more taxes for specific things? 74% of people said they'd be prepared to pay more taxes to feed and provide medical care to poor kids. This is a recent poll. 68% said they were prepared to pay more taxes to train people to get off, to help them get off welfare. 57% said they'd be prepared to pay more taxes for free daycare for the poor. People don't want to pay more taxes because they think the government's spending their taxes badly, with some justification. You know, your lunch is an example of that. But there's lots of others. In Ontario, you know, any letter that the minister signed goes through 5 bureaucrats, most of whom are paid more than $100,000 a year, in order to read a letter. In case the minister should sign something. Okay? So people feel that the government's spending their tax. They work hard to pay those taxes, and they want to feel that their taxes are going to provide a better life for people, and they have a right to feel that. And we should be defending that right, not arguing against it. The other thing I want to leave you with is, but I think I just forgot it because I'm tired. I did forget it. Oh, okay, yeah. On my show, we have a level playing field. It's the only place in Canada, but we do, actually. You know, the right and the left are equal. I mean, we get equal time. There's 2 of us and 2 of them. And I can tell you, of course, I'm very objective about this, that most of the time we win the arguments. When we first started doing this show, 80% of the mail we got was on the right. Now it's about 50-50, sometimes more on my side, sometimes more on Claire's, although they like me better. Even the right-wingers like me better. But now maybe it's because all these left-wingers are desperate to see somebody say something left-wing, but I don't think so from the letters. I think it's just that what we say makes sense. It makes sense to people. It speaks to how they would rather be. They'd rather not be mean and hate people. They'd rather be caring. You know, most people would rather be caring. And I think, and I'll end on this, that we have to talk more about values. The other day on my show, Michael Bliss, you know Michael Bliss? He said to me, well, Judy, you know, we were talking about, I can't remember, something about the deficit or private, we were talking about how business ethics have come to dominate everything. He said, well, you know, Judy, you and I organize our life in a business-like manner. And I said, no, we don't. I said, I take care of my nephew. This is not my financial advantage to pay for food for a teenage boy. Or have his friends over at my house even makes me a lot uncomfortable a lot of the time. But I do it because I love him. That's why I do it. Not because, you know, it's business-like to do it. And people can understand that. We don't live our lives like a business. We don't run our family like a business. There's love in our lives. There's no love in businesses. We take care of each other, our families and our friends. Businesses are there for one sole purpose, which is to make a profit. Families, friends, and government is not about making a profit. It's about caring for people, and we should start talking more about that. Thank you.
you.